So in the war in Iraq, the U.S. is successful in pushing Saddam Hussein out of power, and actually the Iraq government system topples pretty quickly. But the weapons of mass destruction that U.S. intelligence had said were within there, and one of the reasons we went to war, none were found. Iraq did not have a nuclear weapons program as previously told. So George W. Bush will get kind of a bad reputation for starting the Iraq War for not a great reason. And American troops will attempt to set up a democracy once the Saddam Hussein's regime will fall. And elections were held in 2005, but there's some speculation as to whether they were true, free, democratic elections. And essentially, Iraq since then would topple into a civil war that the United States gets involved in and won't get out of until 2011. So it's essentially an 8-year war that we are involved in that many people question the reason why we were. Part of George W. Bush's so-called global war on terror is the idea of preventing domestic terrorism and preventing terrorists from coming to America. So he will establish the Department of Homeland Security, and essentially this centralizes the collection and analysis of intelligence, and also kind of like spying on people legally to prevent future terrorist attacks. And the Department of Homeland Security is still around today. One thing that they will super push and that will be signed into law is the U.S. Patriot Act. And the Patriot Act authorizes the use of wiretapping, authorizes the use of essentially technology-based surveillance, as well as enhanced interrogation techniques or pseudo torture to get information out of people. And that the Patriot Act will allow a lot of government oversight when it comes to stopping domestic terrorism. And that's one thing that the president after George W. Bush will fight against, those enhanced interrogation techniques. During George W. Bush's presidency, we'll get the National Security Agency, the NSA. There will be a scandal about how much power they have to collect cell phone data. Before it was decided, they were just collecting mass amounts of everyone's cell phone data. But then when that scandal kind of broke loose, the law was amended so that the agency could only request that the data from certain targeted individuals be shared with them. So the government can mandate that your data, your cell phone data, your text messages, your cell phone calls and times and where your cell phone was located when they called, that stuff can be tracked, but it's not currently being tracked. It's only if the government feels necessary. They can mandate that those records be pulled for them. Domestically, not having to do with terrorism, the Bushes, including George W. Bush's wife, sorry, that's my dog again, wife, Laura Bush, will really push education. And this is something that conservative presidents don't always do, a lot of funding for education. And one of their acts is the No Child Left Behind Act, which just increased standards and help for low-income schools. And this is kind of where we get the proliferation of Common Core, those standards that schools need to meet and that curriculum that schools need to teach. He'll mandate huge tax cuts. I mean, like, every person that lived during George W. Bush's presidency got like a $300 check in the mail, like $300 more on their tax return. And that's a great thing, but not when there's no government cuts. And that is one issue that George W. Bush kind of pushed forward, was he cut all these taxes, but he did not cut government spending. And in fact, put forth a lot of government spending for a lot of good things like welfare, food stamps, education, low-income stuff, but also a lot of defense spending when you have 2 wars going on and a so-called global war on terror. So he increases government spending and cuts a bunch of taxes, which will get rid of that whole surplus that Clinton had kind of laid the groundwork for. In 2008, the Great Recession will happen. The Great Recession is like 2007 to 2009, it's building. So we say that 2008 is when it started. And it is the largest recession slash depression since the Great Depression in the 1930s. And here is what essentially starts it. Increased federal spending, decreased tax cuts, and the housing market popping. So during this time period, it was really, really, really easy to buy a house. Essentially, the Federal Reserve, which is the U.S. central banking system, had made credit looser, had made interest rates lower, had made getting high-risk mortgages, so lending people money for large houses that they can't super afford, high-risk mortgages will be kind of pushed. Like, let's increase the housing market, let's increase spending. And so when that housing bubble is built and all of a sudden people can't pay their stuff anymore, it pops, the housing market completely collapses and people won't be able to pay their mortgages. The value of their homes is going way down. They have this huge debt burden. Lots of them have to declare bankruptcy. They have more debt than what their house is worth. So they owe more and their house is depreciated in value. And when the housing market is always an indicator of how good the economy is doing. And if the economy is not doing well, the housing market will indicate it. So when the housing bubble popped, that's when we knew the Great Recession was going to happen, and it affects Americans for quite some time. An economic stimulus package is needed, but the government is already in debt. So we need those government bailouts of businesses and banks, but because of large defense spending and welfare spending and tax cuts under the Bush administration, they don't have the money to do that economic stimulus until later. All right, so in 2008, George W. Bush, his second term has come to an end, and we will have an election. So Barack Obama will go up against Hillary Clinton, but will eventually get the Democratic nomination. And his Republican rival is John McCain. He will win that election. He will also run in 2012 and run against Mitt Romney, and he will win that election as well. So we're just going to kind of glaze over Barack Obama, and the reason why is it is in such recent times that we can't really historically analyze what he has done, because what he has done is still continuing on this day. So we can't just close it up and tie it up with a neat little box and say this happened during his presidency. Here it is, because a lot of his policies are still ongoing, still controversial. So not as much on Barack Obama or Donald Trump as my APUSH classes in 20 years will have, but here's a little bit that might show up on the AP test just on a multiple choice question. Okay, so domestically, looking at his plan, he will put forth Obamacare, which is not universal health care. It is mandated health coverage, whether that is through the United States government or through a private practice. So it's called actually the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, but everyone else, including the media, calls it Obamacare. So Obamacare mandates that Americans have health insurance and mandates that health insurance providers do not discriminate against pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions, any sort of disease or chronic illness that someone would have that would make it expensive for them to get health care, because then it would make the healthcare provider have to spend money on them, essentially. So the reason that they put forth Obamacare, that he believes in it, is that for those that don't have health care and then have an emergency and go to the hospital, someone is paying for their care. And by someone, I mean taxpayers. So by mandating health coverage, then people have health care and they're paying into a pool, and that pool of money, instead of federal taxes, can pay for low-income families who have medical emergencies or health issues. The issue with Obamacare, and the issue that the other side would have, more conservative people would have, is that there are some like unintended consequences, less competition in the health insurance sector, as well as some people will see their premiums skyrocket because now to stay afloat, insurance agencies have to raise premiums because there's less competition and the government provides much cheaper health insurance. So a lot of the good things about Obamacare will turn into negative consequences. And a lot of the good things about Obamacare were great, that low-income families could now afford medical care that they deserve. Obama will also repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was a policy where if you were part of the LGBT community and in the military, you're just supposed to keep it secret. And he will repeal that on the basis of that is discrimination, especially in federal hiring, because if you work for the military, you work for the government. And thus forth, you no longer have to keep it a secret if about your about homosexuality if you work in the military. Also, during Obama's presidency in, I think I want to say June of 2015, the Defense of Marriage Act will be struck down, and that will legalize same-sex marriage in the United States. And this is in the Supreme Court case, oh gosh, I'm going to butcher this, Obergefell versus Hodges. And that's a major win for the gay rights movement. Talking about foreign policy here, his presidential campaign, Barack's presidential campaign, was pretty critical of George H.W. Bush's anti-terror regulations, especially the domestic ones like the Patriot Act, the NSA, and the Homeland Security's overreach. And so he will try to relax those measures. But at the same time, he will target terrorist organizations, and some people argue not legally. And when I talk about not legally, I mean drone strikes on terrorist organizations or terrorist hubs that weren't declared war, but were an act of war, especially in places like Pakistan. But mostly Obama will get away with those things. One of his campaign promises was to close Guantanamo Bay, which is a prison in Cuba for political prisoners and terrorist prisoners. And he said that he wanted to close it, but was unable to because of opposition in Congress. During his presidency, a major win, I'm sorry, I'm losing track of my stuff here. Part of the major success in the war on terror is the U.S. Navy SEALs will capture and kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and that's just kind of a long-standing grudge that the United States had ever since 9/11. During Barack's presidency, and something that Donald Trump will deal with, is the rise of ISIS, which is the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, it's said both ways. And this is just Islamic terror organization that it doesn't have a hub in a major country. It's not it's not so much targeting in one area. It's targeting all over the world from different areas. And the one thing that we're seeing today during Donald Trump's presidency is they will proliferate and their organization and recruit for their organization online, which they target a lot of young people, and not just in those Islamic countries, even in the United States. All right, so moving into the presidential election of 2016, Donald Trump will go against Hillary Clinton of the Democratic Party, and he will win. And one thing, all the other presidents smile in their pictures, and he did not, which is just great. So I'm just running over highlights. I'm not even really going to talk about these things so much. Donald Trump's use of the media, Twitter, he tweets all the time, all the time about everything. And so while other presidents have used social media in the past, he is the social media usingest president we have ever had. During his campaign and even into his presidency, there was the whole fake news, hacking sort of scandal. And it's really challenged people, especially teenagers who use social media, to really think about the sources that your news is coming from. So all news sources have a bias. All news sources are made of humans who have opinions, so they will be biased. So thinking like, oh, this news source leans to the left, oh, this news source leans to the right. What is true? What is credible? And that's something that you guys have to think about all the time. Foreign policy, he's dealing with ISIS. He's dealing with Syria, bombing Syria. 1 second.